High in the forgotten reaches of the Appalachian wilderness, a boy of 11 stands beside a weathered cabin, his only companion a scrappy mutt with one torn ear. 2 years have passed since his mother left him at a gas station with $20 and a promise to return. 2 years of wandering, surviving, and finally discovering this abandoned shelter tucked between ancient pines and morning mist. The cabin's roof sags dangerously. Its windows gape like hungry mouths, yet in the boy's eyes burns something rare, not just determination but vision. His calloused hands grip a rusty hammer found in the shed. Beside him, the dog watches with unwavering loyalty, having followed him from those first terrifying days alone. What could one abandoned child possibly build in this wilderness, with nothing but determination and a faithful companion? Could a forgotten place become more than shelter? Could it become home? The $20 bill was worn now, its edges softened from countless unfoldings, the creases deep as ravines. The boy kept it in a small tin box beneath his sleeping mat, a reminder of the last thing his mother had given him. "Wait right here, Jamie. I need to make a call and get some things." 20 minutes, tops." She'd pressed the bill into his palm, fingers lingering for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Something in her eyes hadn't matched her smile. "Get yourself a snack if you want. I'll be right back." That was 2 years ago. The rural gas station had been quiet that autumn afternoon, just off the interstate where truckers sometimes stopped. The sun had been warm despite the chill in the air. Jamie had waited inside by the magazine rack, thumbing through outdoor magazines, imagining himself a mountain man like the ones on the glossy pages. 1 hour passed, then 2. The cashier, a heavy-set woman with kind eyes, had started giving him concerned glances. "Your mama coming back soon, honey?" she'd asked finally. "Yes, ma'am," Jamie had answered with the certainty of an 11-year-old who still believed adults kept their promises. By nightfall, the cashier had called her manager. They'd discussed calling the police in hushed tones they thought he couldn't hear. Jamie had slipped out the back door during a busy moment, the $20 clutched in his fist, his backpack containing little more than a change of clothes and his school lunch. He'd spent that first night behind the dumpsters of a nearby fast-food restaurant, curled into himself for warmth, jumping at every sound. That's where the dog had found him, a scraggly mutt with one torn ear and ribs showing through patchy fur. It had approached cautiously, head low, eyes wary, but somehow hopeful. Jamie had offered a corner of his sandwich, and a bond was formed in that simple exchange. He'd named the dog Scout that very night, whispering the name into the dog's good ear as they huddled together for warmth. The next days blurred together. Jamie had been smart enough to avoid main roads and police cars. He'd learned to wash in gas station bathrooms, to make his money stretch by shoplifting small items from convenience stores. Hating himself for the theft, but seeing no alternative, he'd overheard 2 truckers at a diner talking about the mountains, about abandoned properties where folks could disappear if they had a mind to. Something had stirred in him then, not just hope, but direction. The journey had begun that day. Town by town, Jamie had made his way toward the distant blue ridges, Scout trotting faithfully beside him. They'd slept in culverts, abandoned cars, forgotten sheds. They'd eaten from dumpsters, occasional handouts, and Scout's surprising talent for catching small game. The $20 had been spent with agonizing care. A second-hand jacket when the nights grew too cold, a decent knife from a pawn shop, matches when his attempts at fire-starting failed. Jamie had kept the empty wallet his mother had given him for his 10th birthday, sometimes opening it at night, as if he might find something new inside. He'd been careful to cultivate a backstory for the rare interactions with adults. "My dad's fishing up ahead," he'd say, or "My mum's waiting in the truck." He'd become skilled at appearing unremarkable. Just another kid on an errand, nothing to notice or remember. The mountains had called to him, growing taller with each passing day, promising something he couldn't name. Sanctuary, perhaps. Or just distance from a world where mothers left and didn't come back. Nights had been the hardest. In those quiet darkness hours, doubts crept in like the cold. Had she meant to come back? Had something happened to her? Should he have waited longer? The questions circled like hungry wolves, kept at bay only by Scout's warm presence against his side. "She's not coming back," he'd whispered to Scout one night, 6 months into their journey, the first time he'd said it aloud. The dog had licked his cheek as tears silently tracked down his face. That admission had changed something in Jamie. The waiting had ended. The future, whatever it might hold, had begun. They had pushed deeper into the mountains after that, following game trails and streams, guided by instinct and Scout's keen senses. And then, through a break in the pines one misty morning, they'd seen it, the cabin. Weathered grey boards, sagging porch, broken windows and all. A place forgotten by the world. A place where no one would look for a boy who'd learned the hardest lesson of his young life. Sometimes, the only family you can count on is the one you find along the way. The map was crude but functional. Jamie had started it on the back of a discarded tourist brochure, adding to it with careful marks from a stubby pencil. A circle for the small waterfall where drinking water was cleanest. X's marking thorny underbrush to avoid. Stars indicating places Scout had found rabbit warrens. The map had become his lifeline in the unfamiliar terrain. The journey deeper into the mountains had tested them both. After the initial decision to head upward, away from towns and searching eyes, Jamie had quickly realized how unprepared he truly was. His sneakers, already worn before his abandonment, had developed holes within weeks. He'd wrapped them with strips torn from his spare shirt, making a mental note to look for better footwear in the scattered hunting cabins they occasionally discovered. Food had been their most pressing concern. Jamie's stomach had knotted with constant hunger those first weeks. He'd watched Scout carefully, learning as the dog sniffed out edible plants and roots. Through cautious experimentation, Jamie had slowly built a mental catalogue: blackberries in sunny clearings, mushrooms to avoid, nuts worth the effort of cracking. "Good boy," Jamie had whispered one evening as Scout dropped a freshly caught rabbit at his feet. The dog's coat had already begun filling out, no longer showing ribs. Jamie had stared at the rabbit, realizing he had no idea how to prepare it. His hands had trembled as he used his knife, following instinct and half-remembered nature shows. That night, the taste of meat roasted over their small fire had been the most satisfying meal of his young life. Water had been easier to find but carried its own risks. After 2 days of stomach cramps from drinking directly from a stagnant pool, Jamie had learned to look for moving water, eventually fashioning a crude filter from layers of sand, charcoal from their fires, and the cleanest cloth he could spare. The weather had become their most unpredictable adversary. Spring thunderstorms rolled through the mountains with frightening suddenness. During one particularly violent storm, they'd huddled beneath an overhanging rock as lightning split a nearby pine. The thunder had been so loud that Scout had pressed against him, trembling. Jamie had covered the dog's good ear and whispered reassurances he didn't quite believe. They'd encountered wildlife rarely, but memorably. A black bear and cubs spotted across a meadow had sent them on a 2-hour detour. A rattlesnake's warning had frozen Jamie mid-step on a narrow trail, Scout's growl alerting him just in time. Each encounter had added new markings to his map, new wisdom to their journey. Sleep came easier as weeks passed. The forest sounds, once terrifying, became a familiar lullaby. The whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant hooting of owls, the occasional rustle of nocturnal creatures. Jamie no longer jolted awake at every snap of a twig. Scout's warm body against his back, the dog's ears constantly adjusting to sounds beyond human hearing, provided more security than locks and doors ever had. They'd fallen into a rhythm, walking for most of the day, stopping to gather food or explore promising locations, making camp before darkness fell completely. Jamie's legs had grown stronger, his skin tanned and weathered beyond his years. The softness of childhood had been sculpted away by necessity, revealing a leaner, more capable form. The mountains had secrets they revealed slowly. A hidden valley carpeted with wildflowers, a circle of stones that might have been a campfire from long ago, a cliff face that captured the sunset in brilliant orange. Jamie added each discovery to his map, creating not just a guide, but a record of their growing intimacy with this wild place. It was Scout who had found the game trail that led them to the ridge overlooking the cabin. The dog had darted ahead, returning with excited yips that Jamie had learned to recognize as discovery. Following, Jamie had pushed through a thicket of mountain laurel to find himself on an outcropping of rock. Below, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by ancient pines, stood the cabin. Even from a distance, its condition was obvious. Roof partially collapsed, windows dark empty squares, chimney missing stones near its top. But it was undeniably man-made, a structure with walls and the promise of shelter. Jamie had stood motionless, drinking in the sight. After months of constant movement, of temporary shelters and uncertain futures, the cabin represented something he'd stopped allowing himself to imagine, a place to stay. The kerosene lamp cast a warm, flickering glow that pushed back the shadows, but couldn't quite reach the cabin's corners. Jamie had found it buried beneath fallen roof beams, its glass chimney miraculously intact. A small amount of fuel remained in its base, a forgotten gift from the cabin's previous inhabitants. Their approach to the structure had been cautious. Jamie circled it twice, Scout padding silently at his heels before daring to step onto the sagging porch. Each board had creaked alarmingly underfoot. The door had hung askew from a single hinge, swinging open at his touch with a low, mournful groan. The interior had revealed itself slowly as their eyes adjusted to the dimness. A single room, perhaps 20 feet square. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth strewn with the debris of fallen chimney stones. What might have been a table lay collapsed in the center, its legs splayed like a fallen animal. Along one wall, a crude countertop remained, above which hung precariously tilted shelves. A narrow staircase in the corner suggested a loft above, though several steps were missing. "Hello," Jamie had called reflexively, his voice sounding small in the empty space. Scout had sniffed industriously along the baseboards, occasionally sneezing at the disturbed dust. The first hour had been spent clearing a small corner near the fireplace. Jamie had dragged rotted furniture pieces outside, stomping through cobwebs and disturbing mice that scurried into hidden crevices. Scout had enthusiastically joined the hunt, emerging once with a limp rodent in his jaws, looking pleased with himself. A small cupboard yielded unexpected treasures, a dented pot with only minor holes, a fork with 2 remaining tines, a stack of mouldering newspapers dated 15 years earlier. Most valuable had been the lamp, which Jamie had cleaned reverently before daring to light it as darkness fell. The fireplace, thankfully, seemed sound despite its damaged chimney. Using fallen branches gathered from around the cabin, Jamie had built a small fire, coaxing it to life with his dwindling supply of matches. Smoke had billowed initially, then found its way up the chimney as the draft established itself. The warmth had been immediate and welcome, a luxury after months of sleeping beside open fires. They'd eaten the last of a rabbit caught 2 days earlier, the meat tough but filling. Scout had curled nearby, eyes reflecting the firelight, occasionally lifting his head at sounds from the surrounding forest. Night in the mountains had a different quality from night in the towns Jamie had passed through. No distant traffic sounds, no artificial lights, no human voices. Instead, the forest came alive with its own symphony. An owl called hauntingly from nearby, answered by another farther away. Something, perhaps a raccoon, scratched at the cabin's exterior, then moved on when no food presented itself. The wind spoke a different language in the pines surrounding their new shelter, somehow both mournful and soothing. The sounds that had once terrified Jamie now formed a familiar backdrop. Still, the cabin creaked and settled in ways that kept him alert. Each new noise, a board contracting in the cooling night air, the scurry of unseen creatures in the walls, required cataloguing and assessment. Scout's reactions became his gauge. If the dog's ears merely twitched, the sound was harmless. If he rose to his feet, Jamie tensed in readiness. Sleep came in fits and starts. The novelty of walls around them, of a roof partial though it was, overhead, felt both comforting and strangely constraining after so many nights under the open sky. Jamie had arranged his thin sleeping bag on relatively clean floorboards, using his backpack as a pillow. Scout settled against his side, a warm, living anchor in the unfamiliar space. In the deep hours of night, Jamie had awakened suddenly. For a disorienting moment, he couldn't remember where he was. The lamp had burned out, but moonlight filtered through the broken sections of roof, casting silver patterns across the floor. Scout slept peacefully, paws twitching in some canine dream. Jamie had raised himself on one elbow, surveying what he could see of their shelter in the ghostly light. Despite its broken state, its obvious long abandonment, something stirred within him. Not hope exactly, that was still too fragile an emotion to trust, but possibility. For the first time since watching his mother walk away, Jamie allowed himself to imagine a future extending beyond mere survival. As dawn's first light seeped through the cabin's many gaps, it illuminated the sleeping boy and dog, curled together in a corner of what might, with time and work, become home. The fishing line felt alien in Jamie's hands, so different from the rough bark and stone he'd grown accustomed to. He'd found it coiled in the back of a drawer, along with 3 tarnished hooks and a small metal container that might once have held bait. The discovery had sent a rush of excitement through him, a tool that could provide consistent food if he could learn to use it properly. His first attempts at the nearby stream had yielded nothing but frustration and wet feet. The line tangled, the makeshift pole, a straight branch stripped of its bark, felt awkward in his grip. He'd watched the shadows of fish dart beneath the surface, tantalizingly close yet unreachable. "We need to be patient," he told Scout, who waited on the bank, head tilted in canine curiosity. "Mum used to say good things come to those who wait." The memory had come unbidden, and with it a sharp pang. He pushed both away, focusing instead on the gentle movement of water over stones. By the 3rd day, Jamie had caught his first fish, a modest trout that nonetheless represented a significant victory. He'd whooped with triumph, startling birds from nearby trees. That night they feasted. The next day brought 2 more fish, smaller but still a welcome addition to their diet of forage greens and Scout's occasional rabbit. The cabin itself demanded constant attention. Each morning revealed new challenges: a section of floor too rotted to safely walk upon, a corner where rainwater pooled during storms, gaps in the walls that invited curious wildlife. Jamie addressed each problem with the limited tools at his disposal: a rusted hammer found in what remained of a tool shed, nails pulled carefully from collapsed sections and straightened for reuse, boards salvaged and repurposed. His hands, once soft from a life of school and video games, developed calluses. Splinters became so common he barely noticed them. His muscles ached each night, but it was a satisfying pain, evidence of work accomplished. Water had been their first priority. The stream lay a quarter-mile from the cabin, too far to carry sufficient quantities for daily use. After watching how rain behaved on the partial roof, Jamie had fashioned a collection system using a tarp found under the cabin's porch, stretched at an angle to direct rainfall into the dented pot. During heavy storms, this simple innovation collected enough water to last several days. Food storage presented its own challenges. Without refrigeration, fish and meat needed to be eaten quickly or preserved. Through painful trial and error, Jamie had discovered that smoking meat over a small greenwood fire extended its usefulness by days. A cool, dry corner of the cabin became their pantry, where he stored his growing collection of foraged nuts and berries, dried mushrooms deemed safe after careful testing, and the smoked remains of their protein sources. The forest, initially an adversary to be survived, gradually revealed itself as provider. Jamie learned which plants offered medicine: willow bark chewed for his headaches, jewelweed crushed and applied to the inevitable poison ivy encounters. He discovered which trees offered the best kindling, which stones held heat longest when placed around their evening fire. Scout proved invaluable in ways Jamie hadn't anticipated. The dog's hearing offered early warning of approaching wildlife, a deep growl for potential predators, a different, excited whine for prey animals. His nose led them to patches of berries, hidden in underbrush, to mushrooms Jamie might have overlooked. And most importantly, his unwavering presence kept at bay the loneliness that sometimes threatened to overwhelm the boy in quiet moments. Their days fell into rhythm, mornings spent on cabin repairs, afternoons dedicated to food gathering, evenings for rest and planning. Jamie began notching a stick to track the days, then the weeks. He watched the subtle shifts in his environment, the changing angle of sunlight, the emergence of new plant life, the altered behavior of wildlife, and adjusted their routines accordingly. At night, by the light of carefully rationed kerosene or firelight, he sometimes spoke aloud, sharing the day's achievements with Scout or with the empty room. The sound of his own voice had become important somehow, a reminder that he remained human despite his growing affinity with the wilderness. "We're doing okay, aren't we?" he asked Scout one evening as they sat on the partially repaired porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in fading gold. The dog had pressed against his leg, offering warmth and silent agreement. For the first time in many months, Jamie felt something close to contentment. Not just surviving, but beginning to live. The rain began gently, a soft patter against what remained of the cabin roof. Jamie had barely noticed at first, preoccupied with sorting the day's berry harvest. Scout lay nearby, gnawing contentedly on a deer bone, the remains of an animal they'd found already dead, a fortunate windfall that had filled their bellies for days. By nightfall, the gentle patter had transformed into a relentless drumming. Wind drove the rain sideways, finding every gap in the cabin's weathered boards. Jamie had built up the fire, hoping its warmth would counter the growing dampness. Scout shook himself repeatedly, his coat releasing the earthy scent of wet dog into the confined space. The first leak appeared just before midnight, a steady drip from a corner of the ceiling that Jamie had thought reasonably sound. He positioned the dented pot beneath it, the metallic ping of water striking metal, adding a counterpoint to the storm's symphony. A second leak formed within the hour, then a third. Jamie scrambled to find containers. His drinking cup, a hollow piece of bark, a cracked bowl salvaged from the cabin's debris. The floor grew slick with water that found no receptacle. "It's okay," Jamie told Scout, as much to reassure himself as the dog. "Just a little water. We've been through worse." The collapse happened near dawn. A section of roof gave way with a splintering groan, sending a cascade of rotted wood and frigid water onto their sleeping area. Scout yelped, darting away just in time. Jamie wasn't as fortunate. The deluge soaked him instantly, carrying with it fragments of sodden insulation and the tiny inhabitants of the ceiling's dark spaces, sputtering and shivering. Jamie dragged himself, and what remained of their bedding, to the cabin's one relatively dry corner. The fire had long since succumbed to water dripping from above, leaving only cold ashes in the hearth. Their carefully stored food, days of effort, sat in puddles, much of it ruined. As grey morning light filtered through the new hole in the roof, Jamie surveyed the damage with growing despair. Streams of water coursed down the interior walls. The floor resembled a shallow pond. Their few possessions floated or sat submerged in the rising water. Something broke inside him then. Months of carefully maintained composure crumbled like the sodden ceiling. Jamie sank to his knees in the water, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. All the losses, his mother, his home, his former life, combined with this new defeat to overwhelm his fragile defenses. "I can't do this," he whispered. "I'm just a kid." "I can't." Scout approached cautiously, nudging Jamie's hand with his wet nose. When that garnered no response, the dog pressed his body against the boy's side, a solid presence against the storm both outside and within. Jamie wrapped his arms around Scout's neck, burying his face in the damp fur. The dog stood patiently, allowing the embrace, offering the only comfort he could. They remained that way as the storm gradually subsided, as the rain's roar softened to a murmur, then to scattered drops. It was Scout who moved first, pulling gently from Jamie's grasp to investigate something near the collapsed section. Jamie watched dully as the dog sniffed at a beam that had crashed onto their sleeping place, exactly where Jamie would have been lying if the noise hadn't awakened him moments before the collapse. The realization was sobering. Had he been asleep in that spot? "You're right," Jamie said, wiping his face with a grimy hand. "It could have been worse." The next hours passed in silent, determined activity. Jamie waded through the water, salvaging what could be saved, discarding what couldn't. He pushed the water out through the cabin door, using a flat piece of wood as a makeshift squeegee. The sun emerged, sending weak shafts of light through the hole in the roof, illuminating the extent of the damage, but also beginning to dry the saturated interior. By midday, Jamie stood in the cabin center, hands on hips, assessing. The hole would need covering before night fell. The temperature dropped quickly in the mountains, and his sodden clothes and bedding would need warmth to dry. The stored food required immediate attention to save what remained. Most critically, the roof needed repair to prevent a recurrence. Not just patching, but actual structural work beyond anything he'd attempted so far. Jamie's gaze fell on the fishing line still stored safely in his pocket. Strong, flexible, capable of supporting weight beyond its slender appearance. His mind began to work on the problem, considering how it might be used to lash branches together, to secure a temporary covering until a more permanent solution could be found. "We need branches," he told Scout, who perked up at the sudden energy in his voice. "Straight ones, and something waterproof." The dog tilted his head as if considering this plan. "I know," Jamie continued, "it won't be pretty, but it doesn't have to be pretty. It just has to work." For the first time since the collapse, a fragile determination replaced despair. Jamie stepped outside, Scout at his heels, to gather materials. Above them, the clearing sky seemed an omen, not of easy days ahead, but of possibility. The storm had tested them, had nearly broken them, but hadn't quite succeeded. And in that narrow margin between breaking and bending lay something Jamie was only beginning to recognize in himself. Resilience. Scout's bark echoed through the trees, urgent and insistent. Jamie paused in his gathering of roof materials, head tilting to locate the sound. The dog had wandered farther than usual during their morning expedition, following some scent that had captured his interest. "Scout," Jamie called, dropping the armful of pine boughs he'd collected. The bark came again, not distressed but clearly summoning. Jamie followed the sound through a dense thicket of mountain laurel he'd never fully explored. The bushes gave way suddenly to a narrow ravine cut by spring runoff. Scout stood at its edge, tail wagging with excitement, looking down at something below. Sliding carefully down the steep bank, Jamie found himself standing before the rusted remains of an old pickup truck. The vehicle sat half buried in decades of fallen leaves and encroaching vegetation. Its once blue paint faded to a ghostly patina. A sapling grew through the truck bed, its trunk emerging where the rear window had once been. "Good boy," Jamie whispered, patting Scout's head. The dog pranced with satisfaction at his discovery. The truck's door groaned in protest when Jamie pulled it open, releasing a musty odor of decay and old upholstery. The interior had fared poorly. Seat cushions rotted by moisture and invaded by small creatures, the steering wheel's covering peeled away in strips. The glove compartment hung open, empty of anything useful, but the truck bed held promise. Beneath layers of debris lay a weathered toolbox, its red paint still visible in protected creases. Jamie worked it free with trembling hands, setting it on relatively clear ground before attempting to open it. The latch resisted at first, then gave way with a sudden snap that sent Jamie stumbling backward. Inside, nestled in a bed of rust, lay treasures. A hammer with most of its handle intact, several screwdrivers of varying sizes, a pair of pliers, and most valuable of all, a small handsaw. Beneath these, wrapped in what remained of an oilcloth, a box of nails had survived with minimal corrosion. Jamie whooped with joy, startling a family of jays from a nearby tree. Scout joined the celebration, racing in circles around boy and toolbox. Further exploration of the truck yielded more bounty. A tarp had been folded beneath the driver's seat, protected from the worst of the elements. Though mildewed in spots, it remained largely waterproof, exactly what they needed for temporary roof repair. A metal gas can in the truck bed offered potential as a larger water container. Even the truck's side mirror, still attached and surprisingly intact, would provide a luxury Jamie hadn't enjoyed in months, the ability to see his own reflection. It took 3 trips to transport everything back to the cabin. The tools alone would have been cause for celebration, but the tarp represented something approaching salvation. Within hours, Jamie had positioned it over the gaping hole in the roof, securing it with an ingenious combination of salvaged wire, fishing line, and strategic weights. That night, a light rain tested his repair. A few drips found their way through, but compared to the previous deluge, the cabin remained blessedly dry. Jamie lay awake, listening to the gentle patter on the tarp, filled with a satisfaction deeper than any he'd known since finding the cabin. The discovery changed everything. With proper tools, repairs that would have been impossible became merely difficult. Projects that would have taken weeks might now be completed in days. The saw especially opened new possibilities. The ability to cut boards to specific lengths, to shape wood for particular needs, rather than adapting to whatever nature provided. In the following days, Jamie established a workshop of sorts on the cabin's porch. He spent hours familiarizing himself with each tool, learning its feel and purpose through trial and error. His hands, already toughened by months of survival, developed new calluses in different places. The satisfaction of driving a nail cleanly, of sawing a straight line, of fixing rather than merely patching, these became new pleasures in a life that had known too few. Scout, sensing the importance of their discovery, guarded the toolbox with particular vigilance. He seemed to understand that these strange metal objects represented security in ways his canine mind might not fully comprehend, but could certainly respect. 1 week after finding the truck, Jamie stood in the cabin's doorway, surveying what they'd accomplished. The roof, while not perfect, would withstand the next storm. The worst floor sections had been reinforced or replaced with boards salvaged from less critical areas. A simple shelf now held their meager possessions off the ground. "What do you think, Scout?" he asked, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's good ear. "Starting to look like a real home, isn't it?" Scout leaned into the boy's hand, tail sweeping the newly swept floor in apparent agreement. Jamie's gaze drifted to the hillside, where the truck lay hidden. What other treasures might be waiting in these mountains? What other remnants of human presence might help transform their survival into something approaching comfort? For the first time, Jamie allowed himself to think beyond mere existence, beyond the day-to-day struggle to meet basic needs. He permitted himself to imagine improvements, enhancements, even occasional luxuries, not just shelter, but home. Not just surviving, but building. The first frost came as a whispered warning. Jamie woke to find delicate white patterns etched across the cabin's few glass window panes. The ground outside stiffened and crackling beneath his feet. Scout's breath formed small clouds in the morning air. The mountains had been hinting at the change for weeks. Shorter days, leaves turning from green to brilliant reds and golds. Wildlife behaving with new urgency. Standing on the porch, Jamie watched a V of geese pass overhead, their honking calls fading into the distance. His thin jacket, adequate during summer months, now let the chill seep through. Each breath stung his lungs slightly, a sensation both invigorating and concerning. "Winter's coming," he told Scout, who sat alert beside him, ears perked toward a distant sound only he could hear. "And we're not ready." The wood stove squatted in the corner of the cabin, a cast-iron behemoth that Jamie had largely ignored during warmer months. Previous owners had left it behind, likely finding it too heavy to transport down the mountain. Its surface was pitted with rust, its door hung askew, and the stovepipe that should have connected to the chimney lay in sections on the floor. Now, eyeing the frost, Jamie recognized the stove for what it truly was, the difference between survival and perishing in the coming months. The next days passed in frantic preparation. Using the tools from the truck, Jamie repaired the stove door, securing it with wire where hinges had failed. He scraped rust from crucial joints, applying rendered animal fat as a makeshift protective coating. The stovepipe sections required careful cleaning and fitting, but eventually formed a continuous path from stove to chimney. His first test fire filled the cabin with smoke, sending both boy and dog retreating outside, eyes watering. After adjusting the pipe angle and clearing an obstruction in the chimney, his second attempt proved more successful. Heat radiated from the iron surfaces, quickly warming the cabin's interior. That night, they slept in true comfort for the first time since finding the shelter. Firewood became his obsession. Jamie had maintained a small stockpile for cooking, but winter would demand far more. He established a daily routine, mornings spent felling dead trees with the saw, afternoons dragging logs back to the cabin, evenings cutting and stacking the wood in a sheltered area of the porch. His muscles ached constantly, but the growing woodpile provided visible evidence of progress. Food storage presented another critical challenge. The stream would likely freeze, making fishing impossible. Wildlife would become scarcer. Foraging options would diminish dramatically. Jamie revisited his earlier experiments with smoking meat, improving his technique to extend preservation time. He gathered every edible nut and berry still available, storing them in containers salvaged from the truck and cabin debris. The cabin itself needed weatherproofing. Using moss, mud, and strips of cloth, Jamie methodically sealed gaps between logs where cold air infiltrated. He repaired the door to close more securely. For windows with broken panes, he stretched oiled paper, pages from an old magazine found in the truck, to allow light while blocking wind. Scouts seemed to understand the urgency of their preparations. He ranged farther on hunting expeditions, bringing back rabbits and occasionally larger game that Jamie would never have caught alone. The dog's coat grew thicker, nature providing insulation that Jamie could only envy. His own clothing concerned him greatly. The few garments he possessed had weathered months of hard use, growing thin in crucial places. Using needle and thread from a small sewing kit discovered in the truck's glove compartment, Jamie reinforced what he could. He fashioned crude mittens from a seat cover, the vinyl exterior providing some protection against wind and moisture. The first snow arrived just as the last leaves fell. Jamie watched from the doorway as white flakes drifted down, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and beautiful. Scout bounded through the accumulating powder, snapping playfully at falling flakes, then returning to shake himself vigorously near the stove. That evening, with a steady fire casting warm light through the cabin, Jamie performed a mental inventory of their preparations. The woodpile would last 2 months if carefully managed. Their food stores would sustain them for perhaps half that time, requiring supplementation through winter hunting and trapping. The cabin, while far from perfect, would keep out the worst of the elements. Would it be enough? Jamie couldn't know for certain. His knowledge came from books read in another life, from trial and error, from desperate necessity. The mountains in winter were unforgiving. He'd heard enough stories before his abandonment to understand that much. As darkness fell completely outside, Jamie added wood to the stove, adjusting the damper to maintain a slow, efficient burn through the night. Scout curled nearby, already dozing in the radiant heat. The dog's presence had been Jamie's constant comfort through all the challenges they'd faced. Now, facing the greatest test yet, that simple companionship seemed more valuable than all their physical preparations combined. Jamie ran his hand along the wood stove's warming surface, feeling the promise of heat contained within its iron walls. The stove wasn't just a tool or an appliance. It represented the heart of their home, the center around which they would orbit through the cold months ahead. "We can do this," he whispered, as much prayer as assertion. Outside, the snow continued to fall, silent and relentless, blanketing their mountain sanctuary in winter's first embrace. The day began like any other midwinter morning. Jamie stoked the wood stove before dawn, the cabin's interior still holding the night's chill. Scout stretched lazily by the warmth, his morning routine unhurried, now that snow blanketed their mountain world. 3 months into winter, they had fallen into comfortable patterns. Mornings spent on essential chores, clearing snow from the path to their outhouse, checking trap lines, breaking ice on the stream for fresh water. Afternoons dedicated to cabin improvements that the warmer months hadn't allowed time for. Evenings passed in the gentle companionship of boy and dog, firelight dancing on walls now decorated with simple carvings, and found objects that made the space uniquely theirs. Jamie had just returned from checking traps, gratified to find a rabbit in the snare closest to the cabin. The morning sun glinted off fresh snow, the air so clear and cold it hurt to breathe deeply. He paused on the porch, admiring the pristine white landscape, before turning to the task of preparing their meal. Scout's sudden alertness was Jamie's first warning. The dog stood rigid, ears forward, eyes fixed on the tree line south of the cabin. A low growl rumbled in his throat, not the aggressive sound reserved for predators, but a warning nonetheless. Jamie followed the dog's gaze, at first seeing nothing unusual among the snow-laden pines. Then movement caught his eye, a figure trudging slowly up the path Jamie had worn between trees. A human figure bent against the wind, moving with the deliberate pace of someone conserving energy. Panic flared. In nearly 2 years of mountain solitude, they had encountered no one. Jamie's hand instinctively reached for the hunting knife at his belt, even as his mind raced through limited options. Run, hide, stand his ground? Before he could decide, the figure looked up, spotting him on the porch. A gloved hand raised in greeting. "Hello there!" A deep voice called, carrying clearly in the winter air. Mighty cold day for a hike. The man who emerged from the trees appeared old to Jamie's eyes, perhaps 60, with a silver beard frosted white with snow crystals. He wore proper winter gear, insulated coveralls, a heavy pack, snowshoes that explained his ability to traverse the deep drifts. Nothing about him suggested threat, yet Jamie remained wary, positioning himself between the stranger and the cabin door. Scout growled again, louder. "Quiet," Jamie whispered, resting a hand on the dog's head. "That's a good watchdog you've got," the man observed, stopping a respectful distance from the porch. "Smart to keep his voice down. Sound carries far in winter air." He smiled beneath his frost-covered beard. "Name's Henry. I'd take off my glove to shake hands, but I'd likely lose fingers in this cold." Jamie said nothing, studying the stranger with undisguised suspicion. "Not much for conversation? Can't say I blame you." The man, Henry, glanced at the sky where dark clouds gathered on the horizon. "Storms coming in faster than I expected. I've been hiking these mountains for 30 years. Should have known better than to trust the forecast." He nodded toward the cabin. "I don't suppose you'd consider offering shelter until it passes. Shouldn't be more than a day, according to the weather service." Still, Jamie remained silent, though questions pressed against his teeth. Weather service, forecast, these were artifacts of a world he'd left behind, reminders that beyond their mountain existed normality he'd nearly forgotten. Henry seemed to read his thoughts. "You've been up here a while, haven't you, son?" His tone held no judgment, merely observation. "Living rough. Doing a fine job of it, too, by the looks of this place." He gestured toward the neatly stacked woodpile, the smoke rising steadily from the chimney, the general evidence of care rather than mere survival. The first snowflakes of the new storm began to fall, small but dense, promising significant accumulation. Scout whined softly, pressing against Jamie's leg. "I'm not with any authorities, if that's your concern," Henry said quietly. "Just an old man who loves these mountains enough to risk frostbite seeing them in winter dress. Whatever brought you here is your business." Something in the man's steady gaze, in the simple respect with which he waited for Jamie's decision, eased the tightness in the boy's chest. After nearly 2 years of speaking only to Scout, Jamie found his voice rusty with disuse. "Storm's coming quick," he said finally. "Better come inside." Relief crossed Henry's weathered face. "Much obliged." The cabin felt smaller with a third presence. Henry removed his outer gear respectfully, hanging it where Jamie indicated, placing his boots neatly by the door. He carried a pack that he set gently in the corner, asking permission before removing anything from it. Scout circled the visitor cautiously, sniffing with intense concentration, before apparently deciding the old man posed no threat. The dog settled near the stove, though his eyes rarely left the stranger. "You've done remarkable work here," Henry commented, looking around the cabin with genuine appreciation. "Not many adults could manage what you have, let alone." He trailed off, tactfully avoiding direct reference to Jamie's age. As the storm intensified outside, an unexpected exchange began. Henry shared small luxuries from his pack: real coffee, chocolate, a packet of dried fruit. Jamie contributed the rabbit, which they roasted over the wood stove. Conversation came haltingly at first, then with increasing ease as Jamie's long-dormant social instincts gradually reawakened. Before departing on the storm's second day, Henry left behind an unexpected gift: a camera. Not digital, but an old film model with several rolls of unexposed film. "To document your world," Henry explained. "Some things are worth remembering." Jamie held the camera carefully, this artifact from beyond his mountain sanctuary. As he watched Henry disappear into the trees, snowshoes leaving distinctive prints that would soon be covered by fresh snow, Jamie felt a curious mixture of relief and loss. Their solitude resumed, yet somehow transformed by the brief intersection with another human life. The last snow melted reluctantly, retreating to shaded hollows where it would persist for weeks despite warming days. Jamie stood at the edge of the clearing, inhaling deeply. The air carried new scents: damp earth, green things stirring, life reawakening after winter's long constraint. Winter had tested them severely. Food supplies had dwindled to nearly nothing by February. The woodpile, which had seemed so substantial in November, required constant replenishment. Twice, storms had isolated them completely for days, howling winds making even the short trip to check traps a dangerous proposition. Yet they had endured. Now, with lengthening days and gentler temperatures, Jamie felt a surge of energy that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with possibility. Scout seemed equally affected, ranging farther on their morning walks, returning with mud-splattered fur and the satisfied expression of a dog who had thoroughly investigated spring's arrival. The mountains transformed daily, first with the appearance of tiny wildflowers pushing through remaining snow, then with the haze of pale green as trees budded, and finally with birdsong filling the dawn hours. Jamie was clearing winter debris from around the cabin when he discovered the packet, tucked into a crevice beneath the porch steps, protected from moisture by its waterproof wrapper. The small envelope might have remained hidden indefinitely had Jamie not been so thorough in his spring cleaning. Inside, he found garden seeds, dozens of small paper packets, each carefully labeled in faded handwriting. Carrots, beans, potatoes, tomatoes, squash, corn. Some bore dates from 5 years earlier, others were unlabeled beyond their contents. A previous owner's abandoned plans, perhaps, or a cache forgotten in some transition. Jamie spread the packets on the cabin's table, organizing them by type. The possibility they represented was almost overwhelming. He had foraged successfully, had become proficient at hunting and fishing, but the idea of growing food, of partnering with the earth to produce sustenance, stirred something profound in him. The work began immediately. Using tools from their truck discovery, Jamie cleared a south-facing patch near the cabin where sunlight lingered longest. The soil, when he turned it, was darker and richer than he expected, years of fallen leaves having created natural compost. He marked rows with string, salvaged from his increasingly organized collection of found objects, dug shallow trenches with painstaking precision, and planted according to the crude diagrams on the seed packets. It might not work, he told Scout, who supervised the operation with moderate interest. "These seeds are old, and I don't really know what I'm doing." The dog tilted his head, offering neither agreement nor disagreement. Days passed with Jamie checking the garden obsessively, looking for any sign of germination. He created a watering system, using the gutters he'd installed on the cabin to direct rainfall, supplemented by buckets carried from the stream when necessary. He fashioned crude fencing from branches to discourage the rabbits and deer that seemed unnaturally interested in his project. When the first green shoots appeared, tiny, fragile things pushing through dark soil, Jamie photographed them with Henry's camera. The image would be imperfect, amateur, but he wanted to document this moment of creation. Throughout winter, the camera had remained largely unused, film too precious to waste on snowdrifts and firelight. But this seemed worthy of permanence. As spring advanced into early summer, the garden flourished beyond Jamie's most optimistic expectations. Not everything thrived. The tomatoes struggled in the mountain elevation, and something underground devoured half the potato seedlings. But many plants grew with vigor that suggested they belonged here all along. The first harvest was ceremonial. A few tender young carrots, their tops still feathery, their orange roots slender but sweet. Jamie washed them carefully in stream water, then shared one with Scout, who accepted the offering politely, but without enthusiasm. The taste burst across Jamie's tongue, earth and sunshine combined, so different from the forage foods and game that had sustained them. "We grew this," Jamie said, wonder in his voice. "From nothing but dirt and seeds and work." With the garden established, Jamie's focus expanded to other improvements. He reinforced the cabin's north wall, which had shown alarming signs of weakness during winter storms. He expanded their rainwater collection system, adding filtration that rendered the water cleaner than their previous methods. Most ambitiously, he began constructing a root cellar, a small underground space adjacent to the cabin, where vegetables could be stored through the coming winter. The work was physically demanding, but deeply satisfying. Jamie's body, already hardened by survival, developed new strength. His hands, once soft with childhood, now told the story of his mountain life through calluses and small scars, each marking a lesson learned or challenge overcome, in quiet moments, usually at dusk when the day's work was complete. Jamie sometimes thought of Henry, the winter visitor. Had the old man known about the seeds? Had he noticed the packet's hiding place, but left it for Jamie to discover himself? The timing seemed too perfect to be coincidence, yet Jamie couldn't be certain. What was certain was the transformation taking place, not just of the land around the cabin, which now showed clear signs of cultivation rather than mere habitation, but of Jamie himself. He was creating rather than simply surviving, building rather than merely existing, and in that creation lay a profound form of healing. The knife had taken Jamie nearly a week to carve. Made from a fallen branch of mountain maple, its handle was smooth from hours of patient sanding with progressively finer stones. The blade section was purely decorative, wood shaped to resemble metal, but the craftsmanship showed remarkable attention to detail. It joined 3 other items in his small pack: a pair of carefully sewn rabbit fur mittens, a carved wooden cup with intricate pine tree motifs, and a small pouch of dried herbs he'd discovered had a pleasant tea-like flavor. "What do you think, Scout? Worth the trip?" Jamie adjusted the pack's straps across his shoulders. The dog, sensing an expedition beyond their usual territory, circled excitedly. Henry's winter visit had provided more than companionship and a camera. During their conversations, he'd mentioned a small general store some 7 miles down the mountain, Mason's trading post, where the fire road meets the river. Old Everett Mason runs it, crusty as week-old bread, but fair in his dealings. For months, Jamie had considered this information without acting on it. The cabin and its immediate surroundings had become a sanctuary, a known world where he controlled most variables. Venturing beyond meant risk, of discovery, of questions he couldn't answer, of the authorities who might separate him from the life he'd built. Yet certain necessities couldn't be satisfied by the mountain alone. Salt, most critically. Matches, as his supply dwindled despite careful rationing. Perhaps fabric for winter clothing, as his original garments had been repaired beyond further mending. The thought of facing another winter without these items had finally overcome his reluctance. The journey took most of a day. Jamie followed game trails where possible, skirting the more established paths where hikers might be encountered. Scout ranged ahead and behind, occasionally disappearing into underbrush only to reappear minutes later with silent reassurance. Mason's trading post emerged suddenly around a bend in the fire road, a weathered building with a metal roof gone rust red with age. A single gas pump stood sentinel near the entrance, its analog display suggesting technology from decades past. 2 pickup trucks were parked haphazardly in the gravel lot. Jamie paused at the forest's edge, heart pounding. People. Real people with homes and vehicles and connections to the world beyond. He nearly turned back, but necessity drove him forward. Scout a reassuring presence at his side. A bell jangled discordantly as he pushed open the door. The interior was dimly lit, shelves crowded with an eclectic assortment of goods, fishing tackle beside canned goods, work gloves sharing space with candy bars. A pot-bellied stove occupied one corner, surrounded by 3 chairs, where men paused their conversation to regard the newcomer. "Help you, boy?" The question came from behind a counter, stacked with ammunition boxes. An elderly man with deeply seamed features studied Jamie with sharp blue eyes. "Just looking," Jamie managed, voice rusty from disuse. "You're welcome to look. Buying's better for business." The old man, presumably Everett Mason, returned to sorting fishing lures. But his attention never fully left the strange boy and his dog. Jamie moved through the store with deliberate calm, selecting only his most critical needs: salt, matches, a small bottle of kerosene, 3 packets of needles in different sizes. His gaze lingered on other temptations: canned peaches, a heavy wool blanket, real coffee like Henry had shared. But his meager trading goods would only stretch so far. At the counter, Jamie carefully placed his handcrafted items beside his selections. "For trade," he said simply. Mason examined each piece with calloused hands, lingering over the carved knife. "You make these?" Jamie nodded. "Got skill." The old man set the knife down. "Not enough for all this, though." "What is enough?" Jamie asked, preparing to return items to the shelves. "Depends." Mason leaned forward. "You the one living up in the Pritchard cabin? Old place, mile or so from Eagle Ridge?" Jamie's blood ran cold. "Don't know any Pritchards. No need to spook, boy. Mountain folk mind their business." Mason glanced toward the men by the stove, then back to Jamie. "Been wondering who was smoking that chimney last winter. Figured either squatters or someone with more gumption than sense." The store had gone quiet. Jamie felt the weight of unseen attention from the men near the stove. Scout pressed against his leg, sensing his tension. "Good work with these." Mason tapped the carved items. "Take your supplies. Bring more next time. Maybe some of those berry baskets like the one peeking from your pack. My summer customers, the tourists, they eat that handmade stuff up." The exchange completed, Jamie hastily stowed his purchases and turned to leave. At the door, Mason's voice stopped him. "Boy." The old man's tone had softened slightly. "Mountains get right cold come January. You stop in before then. Got some advice might help you through." Outside, Jamie gulped the fresh air, relief washing through him. He'd done it, interacted with the outside world without disaster. As they began the long trek home, his mind catalogued everything he'd seen in the store, imagining what he might trade for in future visits. Over subsequent months, Jamie established a careful pattern. Every few weeks, weather permitting, he made the journey to Mason's, trading increasingly sophisticated carvings and crafts for necessities and occasional luxuries. The old storekeeper never asked direct questions about Jamie's situation, but offered practical advice in gruff, economical phrases. Other mountain residents, a scattered handful of cabins and homesteads miles apart, became familiar figures at the store. Most showed the same respect for privacy that Mason did, acknowledging Jamie with nods rather than questions. A few shared knowledge freely, which plants treated fever, how to predict storms from cloud patterns, methods for keeping garden vegetables through winter. In these limited interactions, Jamie found an unexpected balance: human connection without intrusion, community without obligation. Each return to the cabin felt less like retreat and more like choice. The mountain remained his sanctuary, but no longer his prison. Scout, who initially approached strangers with suspicion, gradually developed his own relationships, accepting scraps from Mason's sandwich, tolerating pats from a leather-faced woman who sold honey, forming a particular friendship with an ancient hound who accompanied a trapper on monthly visits. Their world was expanding, cautiously but steadily. Beyond the cabin's protective walls, the chess set gleamed in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the newly installed window. Each piece had been carved with painstaking care from different woods: maple for the white pieces, walnut for the dark. The king stood tallest, his crown detailed down to tiny notches. The knights bore flowing manes and alert ears. Even the pawns carried individual character, no two exactly alike. Jamie sat back, studying his creation with critical satisfaction. 3 months of evening work, using increasingly refined tools traded for or purchased from Mason's store. The board itself was his greatest achievement, alternating squares of light and dark wood, edges beveled with a plane borrowed from Cal Erickson, whose cabin lay 2 ridges east. "What do you think, Scout?" Jamie placed the final piece, the White Queen, in position. The dog raised his head from his customary spot near the wood stove, offering a brief tail thump of approval before returning to his nap. The chess set represented more than a game. It marked the transition from necessity to artistry, from survival to creation. Jamie ran his fingers over the smooth pieces, remembering playing with his grandfather on Sunday afternoons in another lifetime. He couldn't recall all the rules now, but the making had been the point, not the playing. Standing, Jamie surveyed the cabin's interior with quiet pride. How different it looked from the abandoned shell they'd discovered 3 years earlier. The roof, once partially collapsed, now stood solid and weather-tight, properly shingled with materials hauled up the mountain over countless trips. The walls, formerly riddled with gaps that admitted wind and insects, had been chinked and sealed, then insulated with a mixture of clay, straw, and moss that kept warmth in winter and heat at bay during summer. The floor, perhaps his greatest structural accomplishment, no longer threatened to give way beneath unwary steps. Jamie had systematically replaced rotted boards with new lumber, some purchased with trading proceeds, some laboriously hand-split from fallen trees. The resulting surface, sanded smooth and oiled with a mixture recommended by Mason, gleamed with amber warmth. Windows that had been empty frames now held proper glass panes, a luxury obtained through months of saving and trading. The door, rebuilt entirely, swung on sturdy hinges and latched securely against the night. Furniture, once limited to salvaged items and crude necessities, now reflected growing skill. A table of split logs supported by a trestle base dominated the main room. 3 chairs surrounded it, one perfectly sized for Jamie, one sturdy enough for larger visitors, and one whimsically carved with paw prints along its arms in tribute to Scout. A bed had replaced the floor pallet of earlier days, its frame joined with carefully crafted dovetails, its mattress stuffed with dried grasses and pine needles that Jamie replaced seasonally. Scout's bed nearby mimicked its design on a smaller scale, though the dog often preferred sharing Jamie's space during colder nights. Shelves lined the walls, displaying both practical items and the growing collection of natural treasures Jamie gathered: interesting stones, abandoned birds' nests, a shed deer antler found during spring explorations. Books occupied one entire section, a precious collection accumulated through trades and occasional purchases. Some were practical, guides to edible plants, basic medicine, wilderness skills, while others offered pure enjoyment, adventures and stories for winter evenings. The wood stove remained the heart of the home, But now it was flanked by neat stacks of split wood, a collection of cooking implements hanging within easy reach, and a stone hearth extension Jamie had built to increase its heat retention. Above it hung a mantle fashioned from a single piece of oak, its surface holding treasured items. The camera Henry had gifted him, now accompanied by several developed photographs. A small carved figure of a dog, unmistakably modeled after Scout, and a smooth river stone with natural markings resembling a smiling face. Light fixtures, simple oil lamps with reflectors strategically positioned, banished the gloom that had once made evenings a time of limited activity. A braided rug, Jamie's first attempt at weaving, added color to the floor. Curtains made from fabric traded for a season's worth of carved items softened the windows. Outside, the cabin's transformation was equally remarkable. The porch had been rebuilt and extended to create a sheltered workspace for projects requiring good light. A split-rail fence, more decorative than functional, defined the immediate yard. The garden had expanded to triple its original size, now incorporating herbs and flowers among the vegetables. A small outbuilding served as both storage and smokehouse. Rain barrels, connected by an ingenious gutter system, collected water from the roof. A stone path laid piece by piece during spare moments led from the porch to the garden, branching toward the outhouse, now boasting a proper door and roof, and the tool shed Jamie had constructed from salvaged materials. Standing in the doorway, looking out over his domain, Jamie felt a sense of accomplishment that transcended pride. This wasn't merely shelter anymore. Every board, every nail, every carefully crafted item represented a choice to build rather than simply endure, to create beauty alongside function, to establish permanence in a world that had once been defined by loss. "We did good," he told Scout, who had roused himself to join Jamie at the threshold. The dog leaned against the boy's leg, grey now dusting his muzzle, but his eyes still bright with devotion. Together, they had transformed not just a cabin, but a life. The crutch was a crude affair, fashioned hastily from a forked branch with a padded crosspiece bound to the top with strips of cloth. It wobbled slightly under Jamie's weight as he struggled from bed to table, its uneven surface catching on the smooth floorboards. "Need to sand it better," Jamie muttered through gritted teeth, the pain in his leg flaring with each movement. Scout hovered anxiously nearby, his usual playful energy subdued by his master's obvious distress. 4 days had passed since the fall. Jamie had been harvesting cedar boughs from a standing dead tree, planning to use the fragrant branches for a new mattress stuffing. He'd climbed higher than usual, stretching to reach a particularly full section, when the brittle wood gave way beneath him. The descent had been mercifully brief, perhaps 15 feet, but the landing unforgiving. His right leg had taken the impact at an awkward angle, the sharp crack audible even over his startled cry. The journey back to the cabin remained a blur of agony and determination. He dragged himself through underbrush and over uneven ground, using fallen branches as makeshift crutches, collapsing frequently as pain overwhelmed him. Scout had stayed close, occasionally whining with concern, but seemingly understanding the need to remain calm. That first night had been the worst. Unable to reach his carefully organized medical supplies on the high shelf, Jamie had lain on the cabin floor where he'd finally managed to crawl, alternating between waves of pain and periods of light-headed detachment. Scout had pressed against him, providing warmth as shock set in. By morning, Jamie had gathered enough strength to assess his injury. The leg wasn't obviously deformed, which offered some hope that the bone wasn't severely displaced. Massive swelling and deepening bruises painted a canvas of injury from knee to ankle. Any attempt at weight-bearing sent lightning bolts of pain through his entire body. Now, on the 4th day, Jamie faced the reality of his situation with growing concern. The pain had stabilized to a dull throb when immobile, sharpening to knife-like intensity with movement. The swelling had receded slightly, revealing more extensive bruising. But most troubling was his increasing helplessness. Water supplies, carefully stored in covered buckets, would last perhaps another day. Firewood, normally stacked within easy reach of the stove, had dwindled to a few remaining pieces. Food presented the most immediate challenge. The pantry held staples, but fresh items required harvesting from the garden. Now an impossible journey without assistance. "Scout," Jamie called softly, patting the bed beside him. The dog leapt up, careful to avoid the injured leg. "We've got problems, boy." Scout tilted his head, ears perked attentively. "I need to figure this out." Jamie ran through options in his mind, each more unlikely than the last. The nearest neighbor, Cal Erickson, lived miles away over difficult terrain, an impossible journey in his current condition. Mason's store lay even farther. No one would miss him. His trading visits followed no regular schedule that would alert others to his absence. For the first time since their arrival at the cabin, Jamie faced the possibility that the independence he'd cultivated might prove fatal. The mountain that had sheltered them now isolated them when help was most needed. A scratching at the door interrupted his increasingly dark thoughts. Scout's ears pricked forward, his posture alert but not alarmed. Jamie reached instinctively for the rifle propped near the bed before recognizing the particular rhythm of the sound. Not a bear or other predator, but Scout's own paws requesting entry. Confusion lasted only moments before understanding dawned. This wasn't Scout beside him, but Scout at the door. Looking down at the bed, Jamie realized his mind, foggy with pain and worry, had conjured the companion he relied upon. "Come," he called weakly. The door, left unlatched for this very purpose, swung open as Scout nudged it with his nose. In his mouth, the dog carried a rabbit, freshly killed, still warm. Jamie's throat tightened with emotion. "Good boy," he whispered as Scout deposited the offering on the floor beside the bed. "Smart, good boy." Over the following days, a new partnership emerged between them. Scout, always intelligent, now seemed to grasp the gravity of their situation with uncanny awareness. He retrieved items Jamie pointed to, dragging heavier objects across the floor with determined strength. He learned to pull the water bucket from beneath the rain barrel's spigot, carefully navigating the full container back to the cabin. Most remarkably, he continued to hunt, bringing small game directly to Jamie's bedside with evident pride. Jamie fashioned better crutches as his strength gradually returned. Enabling short journeys around the cabin, he created a system of ropes and pulleys that allowed him to retrieve items from high shelves without standing. Each small victory over his limitations brought equal parts relief and frustration at the tasks still beyond reach. Nights were the hardest. Pain often intensified in darkness, combining with fears he kept at bay during daylight hours. What if the bone wasn't healing properly? What if infection set in? What if permanent damage left him crippled in this isolated place? Scout seemed to sense these darker moments, pressing closer, offering warmth and silent companionship until sleep finally came. Weeks passed with agonizing slowness. Jamie documented his recovery through careful measurements and notes, using knowledge gleaned from medical books traded for at Mason's store. The swelling subsided completely. Bruises faded through their spectrum of purples and yellows before disappearing. Weight-bearing became possible for brief periods, though the deep ache persisted. "We're getting there," Jamie told Scout one morning as he managed his first unaided step in nearly a month. The dog watched the milestone with apparent approval, tail sweeping the floor in gentle acknowledgement. The injury had revealed vulnerabilities in their mountain existence that Jamie had never fully considered. It had also revealed strengths he hadn't known they possessed. Scout's remarkable adaptability, his own stubborn resilience, their combined capacity to overcome seemingly impossible challenges. The crutch, initially a symbol of limitation, had transformed in Jamie's mind to represent something else entirely. The ingenuity born of necessity, the tools fashioned from what life provides rather than what might be wished for, exactly what he and Scout had been doing all along. The observation post wasn't much to look at, just a small platform wedged between three pines on a ridge overlooking the main approach to the cabin. Jamie had built it during his recovery, when short excursions became possible but longer hikes remained beyond his strength. He'd reinforced the natural formation with salvaged boards, added a simple roof of overlapping branches, and camouflaged the whole structure with pine boughs. From this vantage point, he could see nearly a quarter-mile down the valley while remaining virtually invisible to anyone below. Initially constructed as a hunting blind, it had become something more, a security measure, a quiet retreat, and today, an essential lookout. Jamie lay flat on the platform, the old binoculars he'd traded for steady in his hands. Scout crouched beside him, unusually still, as if understanding the need for absolute silence. Below, moving steadily along the creek that led toward their cabin, came four figures in uniform. The first indication of trouble had come at dawn. Scout's alert posture at the cabin door, ears forward, a low rumble in his throat. Jamie had hushed him immediately, straining to hear what had triggered the warning. Distant voices carried on the morning air, too faint to distinguish words, but unmistakably human. Multiple humans, moving with purpose through their previously private domain. Years of caution had formed habits not easily broken. Within minutes, Jamie had implemented the emergency plan he'd developed but never expected to use. Scout's training activated with a single hand signal. Silent mode, no barking under any circumstances. Essential documents and irreplaceable items went into the waterproof pack always kept ready. Most importantly, the cabin underwent a rapid transformation. Jamie moved methodically, removing personal photographs from display, hiding Henry's camera and the developing kit obtained through months of trading. The chess set and other distinctive crafts disappeared into a concealed storage space beneath the repaired floorboards. He quickly dismantled the small desk where he kept journals and educational materials, the pieces stacked to resemble ordinary firewood. The goal wasn't to hide evidence of habitation, that would be impossible, but to obscure the duration and permanence of their residence. A temporary hunter's camp might draw little attention. A miner living alone would trigger immediate intervention. Now, watching the search parties approach through binoculars, Jamie evaluated their movements with the heightened perception of prey-observing predators. Their uniforms bore patches he couldn't quite make out at this distance. Not military, something else, perhaps forest service or park rangers. They moved with the methodical precision of those executing a grid search, and pausing occasionally to mark locations on maps or consult handheld devices. Looking for someone, Jamie whispered to Scout, whose ears twitched at the sound. Not us specifically. Someone else. Relief mingled with continued caution. A general search meant they weren't the target, but discovery would bring consequences nonetheless. Questions would be asked that couldn't be easily answered. His age, now 15 but small for his years, would raise immediate concerns. The absence of adults would trigger protocols Jamie had carefully avoided for 4 years. The search party drew closer. Through the binoculars, Jamie could now see details, radios clipped to belts, the insignia of the State Forestry Department, the tired determination in their movements. They paused at the stream crossing, just a half-mile from the cabin, one kneeling to examine something on the ground. Jamie's heart stuttered. Had he left tracks during yesterday's fishing expedition? No. He'd been careful as always, sticking to rocks and hard ground. Still, these were professionals, trained to notice disturbances in the natural environment that casual observers would miss. After a brief consultation, the group altered course slightly, heading west away from the cabin's location. Jamie released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Scout remained motionless beside him, dark eyes tracking the retreating figures. They maintained their observation post until sunset, watching as the search party made camp in a clearing 2 ridges distant. The pinpoint of their campfire glowed orange against the deepening blue of evening. "We should check the cabin," Jamie whispered, though there was no one to hear them now. Scout's tail wagged once in acknowledgement, the only movement he'd made in hours. The return journey through gathering darkness required all their woodland skills. Jamie moved silently along memorized paths, avoiding dry branches and loose stones that might betray their presence. Scout ghosted beside him, a shadow among shadows. The cabin appeared undisturbed, exactly as they had left it that morning. Still, Jamie approached cautiously, circling the structure completely before daring to enter. Inside, he lit a single candle, keeping it away from windows where its glow might be visible from a distance. "We're okay for now," he told Scout, who finally relaxed his vigilant posture, settling near the cold wood stove. "But they'll be back tomorrow." Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by the need to check the ridge where the search party's campfire had gradually dimmed to embers. Jamie's mind raced with contingency plans. If they came directly to the cabin, he and Scout would retreat to the emergency shelter he'd established in a cave system a mile north. If aerial search became involved, he'd seen helicopters used in mountain rescues before, they would need deeper cover than the forest canopy provided. By dawn, the search had resumed, but the team continued westward, their voices fading into the distance. For 3 days, Jamie maintained constant vigilance, tracking their movements from various observation points established throughout his territory. Scout seemed to understand the gravity of their situation, obeying silent commands with flawless precision, his natural instincts for stealth proving invaluable. On the 4th day, the search party departed the area entirely, leaving behind only trampled vegetation and a few biodegradable marker flags that would disappear with the next heavy rain. "They've given up," Jamie said, the tension of days finally easing from his shoulders as he and Scout watched from their observation post, or found who they were looking for. Either way, the immediate threat had passed, but its impact lingered. Their mountain sanctuary, once seemingly remote from the complexities of the world beyond, had been revealed as more tenuous than Jamie had allowed himself to believe. That night, by candlelight, he made additions to the emergency plan. More caches of essential supplies hidden at strategic locations, multiple escape routes memorized. Scout trained to respond to new signals that would guide them to safety if words became too dangerous. The mountain remained their home, but now its boundaries seemed more permeable, its protection less absolute. The smoke appeared as a smudge on the horizon, easily dismissed as a distant cloud had it not been for its distinctive coloration. Grey tinged with yellow, rising not billowing, maintaining its shape against the otherwise clear blue sky. Jamie noticed it first from the garden, straightening from his work to shield his eyes against the afternoon sun. Scout, sensing the sudden stillness, looked up from where he'd been dozing in the shade. "Fire," Jamie said, the single word carrying the weight of generations of mountain dwellers who understood its implications. Not the controlled burn of a campfire or brush clearing, but wildfire, capricious, voracious, and utterly indifferent to whatever lay in its path. By evening, the distant smudge had transformed into a defined column, its base spreading laterally along the western ridge. The air carried a faint acrid taste, and ash particles occasionally drifted down like macabre snow. Jamie spent the twilight hours on his observation platform, tracking the fire's advance through binoculars, calculating distance and direction with growing concern. "Too close," he told Scout as they returned to the cabin. "Winds pushing it this way." The mountain had taught Jamie many lessons over his 5 years of residence, but none more thoroughly than preparation. The emergency supplies already stood packed and ready, a habit maintained since the search party incident months earlier. Water barrels stood filled to capacity. The root cellar contained preserved food, sufficient for weeks. But fire presented a threat that couldn't be waited out or evaded by simple relocation. Morning brought confirmation of his fears. The smoke had thickened overnight, obscuring the sun and casting an eerie orange light across the landscape. The distant crackle of consuming flame, carried on the wind, punctuated occasionally by the sharp crack of exploding trees as their sap reached boiling point. Jamie worked with methodical urgency, Scout never far from his side. First the roof, climbing carefully to remove any accumulated debris from gutters and shingles, soaking the wooden shakes with water from buckets laboriously hauled up his homemade ladder. Next, the perimeter, moving wood piles and other combustibles away from the cabin's exterior, clearing a wider space between structure and forest than his aesthetic sensibilities had previously allowed. Most critically, the firebreak. Using the tools accumulated through years of trading and salvage, Jamie began clearing a defensible zone around his home. The shovel bit into earth, exposing mineral soil that would resist embers. The rake dragged away leaves and pine needles that might carry ground fire. The axe and saw removed lower branches from nearby trees, eliminating ladder fuels that could carry flames into the canopy. Hour after hour, he expanded the cleared area, working outward from the cabin in concentric circles. His hands blistered, then bled, then numbed. His lungs burned from exertion and increasingly smoky air. Scout assisted as best he could, dragging smaller branches away from the clearing, remaining close when Jamie's exhaustion required brief rest. By nightfall, the western sky glowed with unnatural brightness. The fire had crested the nearest ridge, still miles away, but advancing with frightening speed through drought-stressed forest. Occasional flame tongues shot skyward as particularly resinous trees ignited, visible now without binoculars. "We should go," Jamie admitted, surveying their preparations with the critical eye of one whose life depended on their adequacy. The firebreak looked pitifully inadequate against the approaching inferno, a child's sandcastle before an incoming tide. Scout whined softly, pressing against Jamie's leg as if sensing his uncertainty. "But this is home," Jamie continued, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Everything we've built, everything we've become." The decision crystallized not as conscious choice, but as bone-deep certainty. They would stay. They would defend. They might fail, but they would not abandon without trying. Through the night, Jamie maintained vigilance, catching moments of restless sleep between hourly perimeter checks. He prepared as best he could, filling every container with water, soaking burlap sacks for smothering stray embers, positioning tools for quick access. Scout remained uncharacteristically close, eschewing his usual nocturnal explorations to stay within arm's reach. Dawn brought no relief, the sun a dim red disk barely visible through smoke that had thickened to a suffocating blanket. Ash fell steadily now, accumulating on surfaces like grey snow. The fire's roar had grown audible even between wind gusts, a deep, hungry sound, unlike anything in nature. By mid-morning, falling embers began landing within their clearing, carried miles ahead of the main fire front by powerful convection currents. Jamie patrolled constantly, stamping out incipient flames, sweeping hot ash from the roof, wetting down areas that seemed particularly vulnerable. Scout had taken to carrying one of the soaked burlap sacks, dropping it at smoldering spots with uncanny awareness of where it was needed. The day dissolved into a blur of smoke and sweat and desperate activity. Jamie lost track of time, measuring progress only in small victories. This ember extinguished, that spot defended, another hour survived. His world narrowed to the immediate surroundings, all thought of past or future subsumed by the urgent now. Evening brought the fire front itself, advancing through the forest with apocalyptic intensity. Trees became torches, then skeletons, then ash. The heat pressed against Jamie's face like a physical force, even from hundreds of yards away. The sound overwhelmed, not just the roar of flames, but the chorus of destruction that accompanied it. Trees splitting, roots tearing from earth, occasional wildlife fleeing with panicked cries. Throughout the longest night of their mountain life, Jamie and Scout fought together to protect their home. When spot fires ignited the garden, they smothered them with wet sacks. When embers collected against the cabin wall, they swept them away before they could ignite the wood. When a burning branch fell onto the roof, Jamie climbed up through heat and smoke to push it away, skin blistering on contact. Near dawn, when exhaustion threatened to overcome determination, the wind shifted, a subtle change at first, then more pronounced. The main fire front, having consumed available fuel to their west, began moving northward, the cabin no longer in its direct path. By morning, the immediate danger had passed. The landscape around them had transformed. Blackened trees stood like sentinels across much of their view, the understory reduced to ash. But their clearing remained a green island in a charred sea, the cabin singed but intact. Jamie sank to the porch steps, Scout collapsing beside him with equal exhaustion. Together, they surveyed what had been saved and what had been lost. The garden was partially burned, the outlying structures damaged. The forest they had known was fundamentally altered. But they remained. Their home remained. "We did it, boy," Jamie whispered, his voice raw from smoke and exertion. Scout's tail thumped once against the porch boards in weary acknowledgement. The firebreak, that desperate last defense, had made the difference between devastation and survival. The book lay open on the table, its pages dog-eared and annotated in Jamie's increasingly neat handwriting. Unlike the adventure novels and wilderness guides that comprised most of his small library, this volume dealt with civic matters, specifically the legal status of minors in their state. Jamie had traded 4 intricately carved boxes for it at Mason's, earning a raised eyebrow from the old storekeeper, but no questions. "Emancipation," Jamie read aloud to Scout, who listened with customary attention from his place by the wood stove. "Legal recognition of a minor's capacity to act as an adult." His finger traced beneath the words as he read, "A habit formed during years of self-education." 6 years had passed since their arrival at the cabin. Jamie's 16th birthday had come and gone, with little ceremony beyond a special meal and a new collar for Scout, crafted from supple leather traded from a trapper. The dog, now showing distinct grey around his muzzle and eyes, remained Jamie's constant companion, though his movements had slowed and his hunting expeditions grown shorter. The isolation that had once represented safety now carried limitations Jamie could no longer ignore. His knowledge, cobbled together from books and occasional conversations, contained significant gaps. His health, while generally good, lacked professional oversight. Most critically, his existence remained unofficial. No documentation, no legal standing, no protection beyond what the mountain and his own ingenuity provided. The wildfire had forced a reckoning. As Jamie rebuilt damaged structures and replanted the garden, a parallel process of internal reconstruction had begun. The fragility of their mountain life had been exposed by flames that nearly consumed everything. What other threats might arise that couldn't be addressed through self-reliance alone? "We need options," Jamie told Scout, closing the book and reaching for the notebook where he'd been documenting his research. Pages of careful notes outlined the legal pathway toward emancipation, the process whereby a minor could be legally recognized as self-sufficient, granted the rights and responsibilities of adulthood before reaching majority age. The requirements seemed designed specifically to exclude someone in Jamie's situation: documented income source, established residence, educational assessment. Yet each obstacle had prompted not defeat, but strategic planning. Over months, he had built a case that might withstand official scrutiny. Mason's trading post provided the foundation. Jamie's crafts, once simple trade goods, had evolved into sought-after items purchased by tourists and collectors. Mason had begun keeping rudimentary sales records at Jamie's request, documenting a modest but consistent income stream. Alongside these, Jamie maintained his own meticulous accounts, tracking expenses and earnings with precision that would have impressed professional bookkeepers. Education presented a different challenge. Having left formal schooling after 4th grade, Jamie's knowledge contained unusual combinations of sophistication and gaps. Wilderness skills and practical mathematics existed alongside limited understanding of history and formal grammar. To address this, he'd established a rigorous self-study program, using textbooks obtained through trade and occasional purchases. The current cabin shelves held volumes ranging from basic algebra to American government. each worked through systematically and documented in notebooks. The residence requirement seemed simplest on the surface. He had certainly established a permanent dwelling. Yet proving occupancy without revealing his unauthorized beginnings required careful consideration. Jamie had begun establishing a documented timeline through receipts from masons, dated photographs developed at a shop in the nearest town, and relationships with neighboring homesteaders who could, if necessary, testify to his presence and self-sufficiency. The most difficult decision had been determining his approach to his personal history. Complete honesty about his abandonment and years alone might trigger interventions he wished to avoid. Yet fabrication would undermine his case and possibly constitute fraud. Jamie had settled on a carefully constructed narrative that acknowledged his unusual circumstances while emphasizing his current capabilities rather than past vulnerabilities. Now, after months of preparation, the time for action had arrived. Jamie gathered the documents he'd assembled, identification papers recreated from memory, letters from mountain residents attesting to his character and capabilities, financial records, educational self-assessments. These, along with a formally worded petition for emancipation, went into a leather portfolio crafted specifically for this purpose. "Tomorrow," Jamie told Scout, who thumped his tail in acknowledgement without raising his head from his paws, "we'll go to town." The county seat lay 30 miles distant, a journey they'd never attempted. Jamie had mapped the route carefully, calculating necessary rest periods for Scout, whose aging joints couldn't manage the entire distance in a single day. They would travel light, carrying only essentials and the precious documents representing their bid for legitimate existence. That evening, Jamie stood on the porch, watching sunset paint the recovering forest in gold. Blackened trunks stood in stark contrast to vibrant new growth emerging from ash-enriched soil. The mountain was rebuilding itself after the fire, finding new forms of beauty amid devastation. "Maybe we can do the same," Jamie whispered. Inside, he completed final preparations. Clothes, his best, though still handmade or traded for, were laid out for morning. Food for the journey waited in a small pack. The cabin was secured against his first multi-day absence, perishables stored appropriately, fire hazards eliminated. Sleep came fitfully, anxiety and anticipation taking turns at wakeful moments. Scout seemed to sense his tension, pressing closer than usual against Jamie's side, offering wordless reassurance. Dawn found them already on the trail, moving with purpose through forest still beautiful despite its transformation. Jamie carried the portfolio close against his body, protected from weather and brush. Each step took them further from isolation and closer to a world of structure, rules, and human complexity largely forgotten during their years of self-imposed exile. Yet it wasn't fear that drove Jamie forward, but something more nuanced. A recognition that true independence came not from isolation, but from engagement on one's own terms. The mountain had given him strength, skills, and identity. Now it was time to carry those gifts beyond its boundaries. "Whatever happens," Jamie told Scout as they paused at a ridge overlooking distant civilization, "we face it together." The deed felt heavier than its single page should allow, its official seal and formal language transforming a simple document into something profound. Jamie carefully placed it on the cabin table, smoothing its creases with reverent fingers. Scout watched from his customary place by the wood stove, grey muzzle resting on paws that twitched occasionally in canine dreams. "It's ours now," Jamie said softly. "Legally ours." The journey to legitimacy had proven neither simple nor straight. The county officials had greeted Jamie's petition for emancipation with initial skepticism that bordered on dismissal. His carefully prepared documentation had earned reluctant review rather than immediate acceptance. Questions followed, probing, occasionally accusatory, designed to uncover inconsistencies in his narrative. Jamie had maintained composure throughout, answering directly when possible, thoughtfully when necessary. Yes, he had been on his own for years. No, he did not wish to discuss the circumstances of his abandonment. Yes, he had established sustainable income. No, he had not attended formal school, but could demonstrate educational competency. Scout had proven unexpectedly valuable during the process. His disciplined behavior and obvious bond with Jamie, providing living testimony to the boy's capability. Several officials had noted the dog's exceptional training and the unspoken communication between them. Recognizing something beyond the typical pet relationship, the turning point came with the home inspection. Initially dreaded as an invasion, the visit had transformed into unintentional triumph when social services representatives witnessed firsthand the life Jamie had constructed. The well-maintained cabin, productive garden, organized systems for water and food, evidence of craftsmanship and self-education all spoke more eloquently than any document could have. "He's not just surviving," Jamie had overheard one inspector murmur to another. "He's thriving." Support had materialized from unexpected quarters. Mason, from the trading post, had arrived unbidden at a critical hearing, testifying to years of reliable business interactions. Cal Erickson and 2 other mountain residents appeared to confirm Jamie's standing in their scattered community. Even Henry, the winter visitor from years before, somehow learned of the proceedings and submitted a written statement describing the capable young man he'd encountered. The legal process stretched from weeks into months, testing Jamie's patience and resources. Trips to town required careful planning around Scout's decreasing mobility and the cabin's ongoing needs. Each journey reinforced the contrasts between their mountain existence and conventional life. The noise, the pace, the constant human presence that simultaneously attracted and overwhelmed. Today's document represented the culmination of that process. Not just emancipation, the legal recognition of Jamie's capacity to function as an adult despite his youth, but something even more significant. Through research into property records, Jamie had discovered that the cabin and surrounding acres had been abandoned not just physically, but legally. Taxes unpaid for over a decade, ownership reverted to county control. With guidance from a sympathetic court clerk, Jamie had filed for adverse possession, the legal principle whereby someone who openly occupies and improves abandoned property for a statutory period can claim ownership. His documented years of residence, combined with substantial improvements to the property, had met the requirements. The modest fees, paid from his craft sales savings, had seemed trivial compared to the significance of the transaction. The deed named him legal owner of 40 acres surrounding the cabin, transforming years of uncertain occupancy into legitimate possession. James Robert Thorne, Jamie read aloud from the document, the formal name he'd reclaimed during the legal process, feeling both foreign and deeply right. Owner of record. Scout's tail thumped once against the floor in apparent approval, yet ownership brought complexity along with security. The legal proceedings had created official records, connecting Jamie to systems and structures long avoided. His existence, once invisible to authority, was now documented and tracked. Taxes would be assessed annually. Compliance with various regulations would be expected. The isolation that had defined their life had been compromised in subtle but irreversible ways. More immediate were the conditions attached to his emancipation. While the court had recognized his remarkable self-sufficiency, certain requirements had been imposed to maintain his independent status. Quarterly check-ins with a designated social worker, demonstration of continued income, most significantly, enrollment in the county's distance education program to obtain his high school equivalency certificate. The textbooks for this program now occupied their own shelf in the cabin, their pristine covers and structured lessons representing a bridge between Jamie's self-directed learning and formalized education. The weekly assignments required regular trips to the county library to submit work and access necessary resources, a commitment that would reshape their mountain rhythms. These new obligations had prompted Jamie's most significant decision, the addition of a truck to their existence. Not the abandoned wreck that had provided tools years before, but a functioning vehicle purchased with savings accumulated through his increasingly profitable craft sales. The elderly Ford now stood beside the cabin, its faded blue paint and minor mechanical issues representing both compromise and progress. Scout had approached the truck warily at first, circling it with suspicious sniffs before cautiously climbing into the passenger seat at Jamie's encouragement. Now he seemed to anticipate their weekly journeys, sitting expectantly by the truck each library day, understanding somehow that this new element in their lives expanded rather than threatened their shared world. Standing at the cabin window, deed still in hand, Jamie surveyed the land that was now undeniably his. Spring had brought vibrant recovery to areas damaged by the previous year's fire, new growth reaching skyward with determination that mirrored his own journey. The garden had been expanded again, incorporating lessons from agricultural texts obtained during his legal proceedings. A small workshop now stood separate from the main cabin, housing tools and projects that increasingly reflected artistry beyond mere function. "We chose well," Jamie told Scout, who had risen stiffly to join him at the window. "This place, this life." The dog leaned against his leg in silent agreement, grey-muzzled but still alert, still essential. Together, they had transformed abandonment into belonging, survival into creation, isolation into considered connection, and in that transformation, both had found their true nature. The sign hung at the entrance to the property, hand-carved from a single piece of cedar with letters inlaid in contrasting walnut, "Mountainside Sanctuary." Below, in smaller script, "All are welcome who come in peace." Jamie adjusted it slightly, ensuring it hung level on the posts he'd set the previous day. Satisfied, he stepped back to admire the work, unconsciously rubbing the scar along his forearm, a permanent reminder of the wildfire 5 years earlier. At 21, Jamie stood taller than the boy who had once stumbled upon an abandoned cabin. His frame remained lean, but had filled out with the sinewy strength that came from years of physical work. His hands, once small and uncertain, now moved with the confident precision of a craftsman. His face, weathered beyond his years, carried the quiet dignity of one who had faced extraordinary challenges and emerged not merely intact but transformed. "What do you think, Luna?" he asked the young border collie sitting attentively beside him. Her black and white coat gleamed in the morning sunlight, her intelligent eyes fixed on Jamie with the devotion he'd once known from Scout. Think Scout would approve? Scout had passed 3 winters ago, peacefully in sleep beside the wood stove that had warmed his aging joints. Jamie had buried him beneath the oldest pine near the cabin, marking the spot with a carved stone that bore a simple inscription: "Scout, first friend, faithful companion, forever remembered." Luna had come a year later, not a replacement, but a new partnership, a continuation of the bond between human and canine that had proven so essential to Jamie's journey. The sanctuary had evolved gradually from necessity to vision. What began as Jamie's completion of his education had expanded into broader learning, courses in veterinary assistance, wilderness management and counseling, all pursued through distance learning programs that allowed him to maintain his mountain home as his primary base. The cabin itself had expanded twice, additional rooms built with the careful craftsmanship that had become Jamie's hallmark. The original structure remained the heart of the property, but now connected to a workshop where he created the furniture pieces that provided his primary income, shipping them to galleries in distant cities where their organic beauty and expert joinery commanded impressive prices. Behind the main buildings, new structures housed the sanctuary's other residents: 3 rescue horses with various disabilities, a one-eyed owl unable to return to the wild, 2 elderly goats from a neglected farm, and a rotating population of smaller creatures in various stages of rehabilitation. Each had found their way to the mountain through Jamie's growing network of wildlife rehabilitators and animal welfare contacts. The newest addition to the sanctuary stood a short distance from the original cabin, a Bunkhouse with 6 beds, a communal kitchen, and a meeting space centered around a stone fireplace. This building represented Jamie's most ambitious expansion of purpose, the culmination of a dream that had formed gradually through his own healing journey. Twice monthly, the bunkhouse welcomed small groups of teenagers facing challenges similar to those Jamie had encountered: abandonment, trauma, loss of direction. Some came through formal programs, others through word-of-mouth referrals. All arrived with the wariness of those who had learned to expect disappointment from adults and institutions. Jamie offered them not therapy in any conventional sense, but experience. Days spent working alongside him in garden and workshop, evenings of conversation around the fire, nights of profound silence broken only by wind through pines and distant owl calls. The mountain that had once sheltered a single abandoned child now extended its healing embrace to others walking similar paths. "Males here," called a voice from the main cabin. Eliza, a former social worker who had recognized something special in Jamie's case years earlier, now spent summers at the sanctuary as a volunteer coordinator. Her retirement had coincided with the expansion of Jamie's vision, her professional knowledge complementing his lived experience in ways that strengthened the program immeasurably. "Anything interesting?" Jamie asked, crossing the yard with Luna trotting beside him. "New inquiry from the veterans group," Eliza replied, handing him an envelope. "And confirmation of next month's garden grant." Jamie nodded, accepting the mail with the calm deliberation that characterized all his interactions. The sanctuary operated on a carefully balanced budget, income from furniture sales and selective grants supporting the rescue operations and youth programs, with Jamie taking only what he needed for his simple lifestyle. As afternoon approached, Jamie completed his preparations for the day's arrivals. Fresh linens on bunkhouse beds, ingredients for dinner harvested from the expanded garden, tools laid out for tomorrow's workshop session. Luna supervised with occasional input, a nudge toward a forgotten detail, a playful reminder when work threatened to become too serious. The sound of tires on gravel announced the arrival of the week's group. 4 teenagers accompanied by a program coordinator Jamie had worked with previously. From the sanctuary entrance, he watched their initial reactions as they emerged from the van. Skepticism, wariness, barely concealed hostility, all familiar responses he recognized from his own journey. One boy hung back from the others, his posture a study in defensive withdrawal. Something in his guarded expression triggered a memory in Jamie. A gas station from another lifetime, $20 clutched in a small hand, waiting for someone who would never return. Jamie moved forward to greet them, Luna at his heel. He didn't rush to fill the awkward silence, didn't overwhelm with enthusiastic welcome. Instead, he offered the simple dignity of acknowledgement, of seeing them truly and accepting what he saw without judgment. "Welcome to the sanctuary," he said quietly. "I'm Jamie. This is Luna. We're glad you're here." The words were simple, but behind them lay the weight of his own journey from abandoned child to builder of sanctuary. From a boy who had once hidden from search parties to a man who now reached out to those still searching. From someone who had needed sanctuary to one who had learned to create it. The hesitant boy met his eyes briefly, recognition of something unspoken passing between them. In that moment, the circle that had begun with a frightened child and a loyal dog discovering an abandoned cabin was completed, not ended, but widened to include others walking similar paths toward healing, toward home,